Welcome to today's episode of The American Paradox, where we're diving into pressing social issues facing the United States today. I'm your host Li Qing from Beijing Review, China's only English language news weekly. Today we're diving into the US chip policy on China. Joining me today is Anthony Moretti, an associate professor of communication, journalism, politics in media at Robert Morris University in Pennsylvania, the United States. Mr. Moretti, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start with the stop-and-go nature of US chip export policy. On January 13, 2026, the US government gave the green light to NVIDIA to export its H200 AI chips to China. NVIDIA praised the move as striking, a thoughtful balance that is great for America. Given the history of abrupt policy reversals, how sustainable is NVIDIA's renewed access to the Chinese market?
I think the comment about the sort of up and down nature of America's entire policy, really, regarding China is something that, cannot be lost here. I always use the metaphor of the pinball and the pinball machine. One day it seems like US policy is going this way, and then all of a sudden it shifts and it goes this way, and there's a big announcement and there's a big conversation. And then seemingly a couple of days later, things change all over again. And so I think whether you're a gigantic company like NVIDIA or whether you're a smaller company trying to find firm footing in the Chinese market, I think the biggest challenge is always, will this White House stick to some sort of policy that will be both good for whatever American values or national security interests that the White House insists has to be in place, but at the same time to also be good for businesses, because businesses, whether they're large or small, are essentially saying the same thing. You cannot do anything to damage our access to the Chinese market. It's bad for business. It's bad for the US. It's bad for China. It's bad for the entire global community. So put all that together. And I think if you're NVIDIA, you're cautiously optimistic that at this point, maybe the White House has settled on an idea that it will stick with. And if that's the case, then that means NVIDIA will probably be able to move forward with a steady stream of exports and sales to China. But again, hanging over everybody's head is that fear of, will the president wake up one morning and say, no, I've changed my mind, and all of that momentum and all of that optimism would go away. The problem here is that you know, for businesses, whether it's research and development, whether it's hiring, whether it's thinking about expanding operations, whatever you think about as being the sort of standard operating procedures for businesses, especially those on the global stage, they need to know that the footing beneath them is firm. And what we've seen in the US over the last 3 or 4 years, what you see is a steady yes, then no, then maybe, then yes, then maybe. And the frustrating part again with that, if you are in the business community, is you can't make plans. And if you can't make plans, then obviously the potential for other countries, other corporations to step in, becomes an issue. So it's a very frustrating time for many U.S. corporations.
More broadly, how are US export controls affecting China's access to advanced chips and chip-making equipment? And what impact is that having on China's technology sector?
When all of this began, the U.S. said that the goal was twofold. Number one, to ensure that U.S. companies did not export the highest level of chips to China. And second, the thought along with that was that if China doesn't have access to these high-end chips, that at the same time, the Chinese internally are not set up to produce their own chips at that same high level. And then all of a sudden, we began to see in 2025, and it's continued into the very early part now of 2026, that China has essentially begun to create chips that are getting ever closer to matching the presumed best chips in the world that generally come from exports from the United States. You know, take take just the chips issue off the table for just a second and think about throughout 2024 and 2025, there was so much conversation in the United States about generative AI and how ChatGPT was essentially the leader. It was in a position that it couldn't be challenged. No other country was going to come close to putting together a product together. And then seemingly overnight, DeepSeek came along. And in the United States, the answer or the reaction to it was largely, where did that come from? And that's been in many ways the reaction to in the US, especially in government circles, as we see China developing a very strong, very vibrant domestic chip market. The feeling is, wait a minute, we were supposed to block this. How did it happen? And essentially, what happened is that Chinese ingenuity took over, and the best minds and the most sophisticated minds got together and said, okay, how do we put together something like this? And again, what we're seeing is continual movement in the technology community, in the academic community, in the research community. Whatever gap existed, it is getting more and more narrow year by year. And that clearly indicates that trying to block the Chinese has not been a successful strategy.
Critics argue that fear-driven China policies, such as the CHIPS Act and sweeping export controls, may actually undermine long-term business stability and U.S. competitiveness. From your perspective, how do these policies affect America's economic and technological leadership?
The word fear is the critical jumping off point for any answer relating to that question. If you think about just as a human being, when you're afraid, you tend to not make the best decisions. You either rush to make a decision, you grasp for something that seems like the safest or the most practical decision, but in reality, you've not looked beyond, and seen the bigger picture. And especially with the CHIPS Act that was touted by then President Biden and the Congress in 2022, this was supposed to be the proverbial game changer in the United States. And when you looked past the political rhetoric that made it sound like this thing was perfect and golden and was going to be a real difference maker, you looked from a tax perspective, it didn't hold up to scrutiny. You looked in terms of whether the many of the or the built-in ideas and the strategies associated with the CHIPS Act, those didn't hold up to scrutiny as well. And so what's happened is there's a real necessary question to be asked, and sadly, it's not being asked in the United States. And that is, has the CHIPS Act really worked? And maybe more importantly, is it time to stop thinking about policies that are built around this idea of fear, about this idea of containing China, of this idea of blocking China, of this idea of, everything is national security? Well, if everything is national security, then at the end of the day, really nothing is national security. And instead, maybe it's time to have a real frank conversation about what it means to see China as a partner and an ally in ensuring that AI, whether it's AI governance, AI development, AI rollout, whatever term or ideas you want to look at, that, and again, AI is just one example, but that AI is rolled out in such a way that it is beneficial to the entire global community, not just one particular country or one particular part of the world.
What are the broader implications of U.S. chip export restrictions for global supply chains, technological competition, and the future of China-U.S. trade and relations?
The only realistic path forward, I guess is the better way to put it, that I see, is to stop looking at the development of China and the growth of China as a dangerous situation for the United States. again, to go back to something we said a couple of minutes ago, if you base everything through the lens of national security, then, at some point people are going to look around and go, is that really it? There has to be a broader conversation that takes place. And again, what that gets back to is the more you attempt to restrict one particular company with the complexity of supply chains as they are across the world these days, you do something to try to block or rein in China. That has implications in Vietnam. It then has implications in Indonesia. It then has complications in Japan, and then in Western Europe, and then in Eastern Europe, and then and then in South America. My point being, you can't just simply look at this from a us versus them, one country versus another standpoint. The supply chains was something that by and large most people didn't really care about because it seemed like everything worked, and then along came COVID and everything stopped, and then along came these ridiculous or the continuation of these ridiculous tariffs that the United States put together. You look at those two factors and you begin to say, wait a minute, supply chains are really so intricately connected. It's a little bit like a connecting flight from one city to another. A delay in one flight has implications for 6, 8, 10, 12, 15 other flights somewhere else around, a particular country. And so what we need to see, and I hope we see it soon, although I'm not convinced it's going to happen with this president, is to ensure that there are frank, open, and real conversations that acknowledge every time you try to restrict one country, in reality, you're restricting many, many more.
There's an interesting metaphor from Chinese literature that I like to bring here. Renowned Hong Kong novelist Louis Cha wrote about the martial arts technique called Qi Sha Quan or seven injuries boxing. The idea is that in order to hurt your opponent, you first end up seriously injuring yourself. It's often used to describe strategies that harm both sides, sometimes almost as much as they harm the target. Some observers see recent US chip restrictions on China in a similar light. Do you think that comparison is fair?
I think it is, and I'll use the same idea of trying to harm an opponent versus harming yourself. Many of your listeners will probably remember Mike Tyson, who was one of the greatest heavyweight champion boxers in the United States, especially over the last couple of decades of the 20th century. And he was asked once about the strategy that boxers have to try to either fight him or beat him. And he said, everybody has a plan until I punch them in the nose. And, the US continues to have a plan for how they think they're going to contain China. And then China turns around and somehow punches you in the nose. And I don't mean that in a derogatory or a mean way, but what I mean is that China has a built-in strategy. China thinks long term. China doesn't think about 2 weeks or 2 months or even necessarily 2 years. It maybe thinks about 2 decades. And so as a result, as the US flops around thinking it has the next great idea or the next great strategy, China turns around and ends up doing something that leaves the US and its allies and really the entire global community wondering, I think you did more damage to yourself in trying to contain China than you would have done had you accepted it and recognized it as a partner and moved forward in that true spirit.
Finally, looking ahead 5 to 10 years, how do you expect US chip export policies toward China to evolve?
My hope is that what we see in the future is less rhetoric that is negative and more reality that is positive, that we stop seeing this idea that China is trying to undermine the global order and is trying to sort of rebuild the world in its own image, that there stops being this nonsensical idea that China is looking to start a war here, there, or everywhere, because there's no history of China ever doing such a thing. I hope there is a recognition that the more you try to contain China, the more what you actually do is to further fire up the spirit of ingenuity and progress in the country. That every time you try to contain China or rein it in, the Chinese people turn around and say, okay, challenge accepted. And they roll up their sleeves and they get something done. Um, China deserves a place at the main table when you talk about or think about the most important countries of the 21st century. And so as a result, it is imperative, I believe, imperative on the part of the United States to throw into the trash can these ridiculous ideas of containment and these ridiculous fears about national security, and instead say the two of us together, working hand in hand, can do far more to benefit the world than either one of us can do alone.
Thank you very much for your insightful analysis today.
Thanks for the conversation and the invitation.
That's it for this episode of the American Paradox. What do you think? Let us know. This podcast is produced by Beijing Review. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a comment, and share it with someone who is interested in this topic. I'm Li Qing. Until next time, stay curious.